Joachim and I have been friends and colleagues, so it's an honor to introduce him to kick off this year. He's, I think, a perfect person for that. The first 24 years of his adult life, he was a Trappist monk, so he was living within the institution in a very deep way. And his experiences around faith and theology and spirituality kind of evolved in that smaller circle. And but then in 1975, he joined us at John 23rd and as a theologian residence in Fort Collins and Greeley. And his world expanded mightily for all those years since then. And he's been involved in this dialogue, both in a public way, but also inside himself, since 1975. So this interaction between the wisdom that comes out of the world of science and the wisdom that comes out of the world of spirituality, faith, and religion have been dialoguing publicly, but also internally within him all those years. So he's going to share some of the insights that have evolved over all those years of also dealing with these same kind of interactions. So if you would stand up, Joachim, we'd like to offer him a blessing to begin with. So if you just raise your hands, and whatever way you're best to give a blessing, just offer him that gift. Amen. Thank you.
Is this on?
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yes.
I knew this was going to be a diverse audience, or I thought it was going to be very diverse. Not everybody's Catholic, not everybody's Christian. But I didn't know there were going to be 4 or 5 research scientists here. It's a little overwhelming. So I'm glad I have friends. And actually, the 4 or 5 scientists are people I've been in a conversation with for the past, since I've been at CSU. Wayne Viney, and Sandy Kearns, and Jim Lyman, Linda Joyce. So my task tonight is not to enlighten the scientists among us, but to sort of set the scene and invite you to come back to this series where we have some really good and diverse speakers. And tonight I just thought I'd like to highlight opportunities, challenges, and breakthroughs in this conversation between science and religion. And as I reviewed my own history, as Jim said, it's kind of interesting. I spent 24 years as a monk and priest and theologian teaching seminarians and monks what the church teaches so they can go out and preach it. And then I spent the second 24 years trying to talk about that in a state university philosophy department, where not everybody was particularly impressed with religion in general, or Catholicism in particular. So, so I've been involved in this conversation trying to talk across paradigms. And that's not an easy thing to do. So I thought what I'd do tonight, there are 3 or 4 things that seem to me important from my experience in this conversation that I'd like to share with you. And as I said, it's a public dialogue between scholars, but it's also an internal dialogue for many of us. We didn't all grow up in a faith tradition, but we all grew up with a worldview. And when you become educated, I think the college education is like going back through the Enlightenment again in 4 years. You find out that your worldview is historically and culturally particular, historically and culturally and socially shaped and biased. And what do you do with that when you encounter other cultures and when you encounter science? So when I was talking about this, some of my friends said, well, I hope you help people deal with that inner dialogue and not just talk about the public dialogue. So the scope of this dialogue is vast, the possible scope. Because both science and religion are vast. St. Thomas said, Aquinas, theology deals with all things inasmuch as they're related to God. And you can almost say that about science. There's nothing untouched. Mathematics, physics, astronomy, biology, evolution, process thought, ecology, climate change, quantum physics, astrophysics, not to mention psychology, sociology, the social sciences in general. So this series picks 3 topics with experts in each of those topics to lead a conversation for this series, and that will be evolution, neuroscience, and climate change. The next big one would be, and I'm glad Sandy Kearns is here because this is too tough to tackle right now, but if you really want a challenge, you should start asking, what does quantum physics do to your theological presuppositions? That is something we're not going to touch on here, but I hope someday we will. So the 3 themes, you might wonder how I got these 3 themes. The first one, these come out of my courses. I taught Meaning and Truth in Religion. Holmes Ralston passed that on to me, and I changed it quite a bit. And I taught New Testament interpretation. So I'm interested in hermeneutics, the art of interpretation. And so I'd like to start with conversation and the art of interpretation. And then I'd like to talk about the fact that we live with a tension between our received worldview and our ever-widening circle of experience and study and encounter. And then I'd like to end with where this has left me as a Catholic theologian who still identifies as Christian and Catholic. Although I think religious identity for a lot of us is plural and processive, with porous boundaries and negotiated and somewhat hybridized. But having said all that, I think I'm a Roman Catholic. In this first part, I'd just like to give an image for the evening, and I hope for this series. And as I said, as I sort of share my process with you, I'm assuming that you will be sharing your process. And knowing so many of you, I know you won't be shy about responding, that you might see some of these things a little bit differently than I do. This thing on classics and hermeneutics, there are philosophers who talk a lot about hermeneutics, and I'm indebted here. I got a lot of this philosophy through David Tracy, who's a theologian at Chicago Divinity School, and he wrote a book called The Analogical Imagination. Some people write books every month, and I think you shouldn't spend more than a week on such books. People like David Tracy wrote 3 books in his lifetime, and it took him a lifetime. But anyway, he talks about a classic. A classic is could be a person, could be a text, could be an artwork, could be a historic person. A classic, it would seem, is always raising perennial questions and offering solutions worthy of consideration. That's carefully said. Perennial questions worthy of consideration. And the idea is that if a classic really engages you, a conversation begins. And that conversation can be almost like a game. And in a game, if you're skiing, you forget your anxieties, you forget everything except skiing. And sometimes in a good conversation with a classic, or with a person, or with science, you forget the agendas you brought, and together you run off in pursuit of these new emerging questions. And in that moment, sometimes, understanding happens. It's kind of an indirect way to look at interpretation and understanding. But I really like it. And when understanding happens in that case, we are changed. what we see in the world has changed. What we make of the world has changed. The world is transformed, and we are transformed. And I'm thinking, we had a priest at John 23rd who was a natural naturalist and a mystic. He spent his days out in the prairies when he could. And I had to write a reference for him once he decided, after being a priest for a number of years, he was going to do wildlife biology. I had to write him a reference. And I said, if you walk through the woods with Jim Lewer, some of you remember, the woods will never be the same again. And that's been my experience with Jim Lewer. My trip to India with Jim Boyd will never be the same again. And I guess I need to say this somewhere, because the other night I attended an exhibition of Jim Boyd, who taught Eastern religions his whole life, lived in Persia, lived in India, made an artwork of passing over into other cultures. He has magnificent photos. And now that he's retired, for his children's sake, he has written a poem on each of these photos. And each of those photos is an encounter with classic culture. And I've been talking to Jim Boyd for 40 years, but I never got inside him until I read his poems. And what he sees in each of these pictures, he sees the archetypal. He sees what is archetypal in these images, and he lives by it. That's what I mean by conversation leading to understanding, if it engages you. So what would it take for that kind of a conversation? When I was sent to CSU, I was sent to establish a mutually, this is from David Tracy's phrase too, mutually respectful, mutually critical, mutually transforming conversation. What would it take for a conversation to be mutually critical, mutually respectful, and mutually transforming? For understanding to happen, for conversation to happen, we have to respect the text. We have to be engaged. If what the text is talking about, if it never gets us, if it doesn't grab us, no conversation will happen. And if you don't respect the text, or the person, or the culture, or the worldview, I don't mean you have to agree with it, but if you really don't respect it, I don't see how it can engage you, and I don't see how conversation can happen. Mutually critical, the people who talk about hermeneutics talk about, we always bring a pre-understanding to a text or a classic event. And the text wants to challenge that pre-understanding. That's what I mean by mutually critical. It's okay to be mutually critical if it's done with respect. And if it's done with what Thich Nhat Hanh calls deep listening. And probably the two big ones that this is the challenge in the science-religion debate. There are people on the scientific side who, it's called naturalism, and I had some friends at CSU who really established that well, so I know what they mean. But that's a philosophy, not a scientific statement. It's a philosophical statement which you can argue. So you might want to point that out. And John Hott, of course, has a big part of what he talks about is scientific naturalism, which doesn't really seem to be much room for the supernatural. On the religious side, I think of fundamentalism, and I don't mean this to be judgmental, but the way I understand it as an arrested stage of spiritual development. It's a stage of development, but it's an arrested stage of spiritual development. And that makes conversation difficult. So those two on each side, we have to challenge one another and try to work through. Those are the challenges. And when you do that, that kind of a conversation is like passing over, which is a term Jim Boyd has used and I tried to use in religious studies, where you pass over into the world of somebody else. And when you come back, you see the world differently. If a student spends a year abroad and comes back to CSU, it may be that the campus looks smaller than it did before, intellectually as well as physically. So if you pass over to another religion, just trying to pass over, and if your world has been changed, somehow you were tainted by the revelation. You were changed by that's the image I'd like for the science-religion conversation. I have all my parts here. The second theme I'd like to talk about is that I had mentioned in my introduction, because this is a challenge which also inhibits the conversation. Those of us who grew up in a religious tradition eventually awaken to the fact that we have been profoundly shaped in myriad ways by that tradition. You can't ever totally get out of it. But the interesting thing is, the more you see that you were historically and culturally conditioned, it seems like to that extent you're somewhat liberated from it. So when we discover that our tradition is historically and culturally particular, what do we do when we encounter others? And there are some choices there that I've talked a lot about, and it's important for me in this conversation. Can you all hear me? Good. When I first came to Fort Collins, there was a lot of people talking about theology from above and theology from below, and I sort of worked on that in finishing up my doctoral thesis. Theology from above is classical theology. Theology from above, which I was taught in Rome, I was sent to Rome so that I would get the Orthodox teaching. In 1963, the Pope wrote a letter saying anybody teaching in the seminary has to have a degree from Rome, so be teaching the right thing. That's how I got to Rome. After the Second Vatican Council went to Louvain, I got a little different picture. So, classical theology, that theology from above, took classical theology, we studied St. Thomas Aquinas in Latin, it took classic theology as a finished product which was normative. And a lot of us grew up with that. So divine revelation with a capital R is that classical theology, which is a finished product and which is normative. A little hard to have a conversation with another culture with that. Theology from below was a reaction to that when history finally hit Catholicism, about 100 years after it hit Protestantism. People found out that those doctrines were the product of a process, and that it'd be hard to understand the product of the process if you've never been through the process. So they wanted to historically reconstruct. How did it happen that the early Christians thought of Jesus as a story of God? And I was teaching Hans Kuhn, Ralston had been using it, and so I used it also in Religions of the West on being a Christian. And he was talking about theology of story, and he did a wonderful job telling the story of Jesus and why it was that some people coming out of the Jewish tradition began to see that story as an encounter with God. So they thought they'd had an encounter with God in that story. You don't have to agree with it, but at least you can understand why they were saying, and the students loved it. I mean, they understood who Jesus was. They didn't become Christians or Catholics. They didn't believe in Christology necessarily, but they understood what was going on. They understood the story of Jesus. It's a pretty nice story. That's theology from below. And in those days, we were pitting one against the other, theology from above, theology from below. And a lot of the theology, Roger Haight has like 10 books in my bibliography here. And it's all theology from below. We start with experience and we move back up. But I've come to realize that there is no pure theology from above. You can't erase your past. And there is no pure theology from below. But we live with a tension between our received tradition and our ongoing experience. Christian women who start reading feminists have a whole new experience to deal with, and that leads to feminist theology. People from South America went to Europe to study, like I did, and they were taught political theology. And that was it came out of a dialogue with, post-Vatican II dialogue with Marxism and Christianity. And so when they went back to South America, they said, how do we talk about God to that 2/3 of humanity who doesn't have enough to eat? You're going to talk about political theology? Out of that came liberation theology. You give them the experience of liberation. Then if there's time, you explain the sort of theological basis of that. So that's not a static view. The reason I'm saying that for this conversation is living in the tension between your received tradition and your ongoing experience, and having a conversation between those two, and leaving yourself open to new revelatory experiences. That can't happen if you think that your tradition is set in stone and finished and unchangeable. So that's an obstacle, I think, on the religious side for some people to enter into a conversation with culture. And we can see that. It's hard to talk about conversation and not think about what happens on TV, but I won't go into that. Political debates are not really an example of what I'm talking about in terms of conversation. I want you to mention the guy with the hair like mine. And this has always been going on for people who are worried about that. This should be a liberating experience that it keeps growing and changing. The Old Testament writers, we now know historically, they were using pre-existing creation stories, but they edited those pre-existing creation stories on the basis of their religious experience. And the rabbis, just before the time of Jesus, they re-edited those stories in light of their experience. And the New Testament is a re-editing of all of it in the light of the Jesus event. And St. Thomas rewrote Augustine in the light of Aristotle. The Muslim scholars translated Aristotle into Latin so that St. Thomas could read it. And that's why when David Dean came here a few years ago, he was always talking about St. Augustine, and I couldn't understand it at all, because he was reading St. Augustine from an evangelical point of view, and I was reading St. Augustine through the eyes of Aristotle. He came out with very different answers. Okay, I got time. Let me just say a little bit about Revelation then and now, and then we could stop for questions if you like. Presupposed to what I'm saying, and this is old stuff for a lot of people, but I think it's essential in order to have a conversation between science and religion, and it's why in many cases it can't happen. Revelation need not be understood as a set of propositions set in cement. Revelation doesn't have to be seen as propositions. It depends on what you mean by knowledge. Revelation can be seen as an encounter with the mystery within which we all live our lives. In the Hebrew Bible, glory is the reflected light of something you can't see in itself. Like a room is full of sunlight, but you can't see the sun. So for the Hebrew Bible, glory is God's reflection that you might see in creation. So the point is that those revelations didn't just happen once in the past. But if you use revelation with a capital R, divine revelation, that's sort of what we imply. But those revelatory experiences, maybe revelatory experiences is a word that most people here tonight could talk about. Revelatory experiences. They happen, to me, in good liturgy, in good nature experiences, in good reading, in moments of deep mindfulness, in good conversations. And I wanted to quote, and I gave it to you in a handout. I was so impressed thinking about this. You don't think of popes saying this. You think of popes saying classical theology. You usually only quote their venerable predecessors. You don't quote anybody else in these encyclicals. And they write in a different language than Francis writes. But here's what he wrote a footnote in his encyclical on climate change. It was a quotation from a Sufi mystic. Prejudice should not have us criticize those who seek ecstasy in music or poetry. There's a subtle mystery in each of the movements and sounds of this world. The initiate will capture what is being said when the wind blows, the trees sway, water flows, flies buzz, doors creak, birds sing, the sound of strings or flutes, the sighs of the sick, the groans of the afflicted. These are all revelatory experiences. So revelation can come from anywhere. And our job, this is not a static view of reality. This is a processive view of reality. And this view, I think, is open to a conversation with science. It gives you the freedom to be open. And it seems to me the static classical worldview, although they did, I mean, St. Thomas and his teacher, Albert the Great, Hildegard of Bingen, a lot of course, they were far more subtle than we think they were. But they were, a lot of them were involved with the science of their day. I'd like to stop here for a minute and then go on to sort of the nature of religious language, which I think is a big issue, a big challenge for the conversation between science and religion. I think we use different languages. So before I get to that, maybe we could take 2 or 3 comments or questions just so I get a feel for, I know most of you, but it'd be nice to know what you're thinking, what you'd like to say. But would you please, for everybody's sake, speak into the microphone first. There's a microphone on each side. If you want me to clarify something, or you just want to comment, or are you with me?
Yes. Yes, I'll start it off. So Joachim, I'm thinking, since we probably have lots of university people here, that if the tension might also be exemplified by, they use a textbook to teach a class, say neuroscience or an ecology. And so the textbook is static, it's a textbook. But all the while, the students are studying that textbook, lots of new things are being learned. So would you call that an example of a short time scale, tension between holding something constant and the process of growth?
Yeah, I do. And when I looked over, the first thing I did, I looked at my bookshelf, and I have a 3-page bibliography here. I didn't put them all down. They go back to 1975. Ian Barber, Myths, Models, and Paradigms in Science and Religion. And a lot of that science and religion was sort of classical. I mean, I think Meaning and Truth, when I inherited that course in the philosophy department, it was about Christian doctrines and how you could reconcile them with culture. And a lot of science and religion was that. And the best of that, most recently, I think, is John Haught's book I've been reading, and that's why some of this I owe to him, because I've been reading it this summer, Science and Christianity. But he does a really good job. He starts out by saying, we're talking about mystery, folks. And he gets that real clear in the beginning. And then he has a tour de force of just a 1-chapter summary of Teilhard de Chardin. Just a wonderful job of what the vision that Teilhard de Chardin had of the whole universe as a living organism. And then he goes on with other Christian doctrines. And like Ralston, but he's in dialogue with Ralston, and Elizabeth Johnson quotes Ralston every 4 or 5 pages. And Haught quotes Ralston, and Ralston quotes Ian Barber, and they're all quoting, so it is an intertextual conversation. But you're right. I read about the life of Einstein, and according to the book I read, it took him 20 years to get a job because he insulted all his professors. He couldn't get a job because he was reading, as a student, he was reading all the things his professors were supposed to be reading, and they weren't reading. And he didn't take kindly to that, and they didn't take kindly to him. So I don't know if that's a comment or not.
It's a comment about Einstein.
It seems to me that revelation is often a threat to an ordinary Christian, maybe even the extraordinary Christian. They don't expect revelations. They just expect to follow the rules and get along all right. What is there about a revelation that scares us?
Yeah, I guess, Sally McFague is another person who appears in my bibliography. She's like 10 books on this. She talks about language, and that language in its infancy is always metaphorical, and when language gets old and effete, it becomes literal. And I think everyday usage of terms like that, detached from experience, become doctrines, and the people don't have the experience that the doctrine is pointing to, and so the doctrine falls flat because it's just another abstract idea that they can't relate to. That's why I think maybe if we, theology from below would say, let's talk about revelatory experiences. I mean, a lot of people at dinner tell me this was really revelatory. They're not calling it divine revelation. Well, I think divine revelation is, my religious tradition has some insights that have proven very valuable and very important. But I think we forget what's happened in the past 50 years with revelation. We understand that revelation, that if there is religious experience, it's an encounter with the ultimate mystery. You might have revelatory experiences, but when you interpret, you always interpret them. So it's always I think what we call knowledge is interpretation. David Tracy says truth is a relatively adequate interpretation of the data. That's a mouthful. A relatively adequate, it's the best you can do for the moment. So I think if we understood, and Lonergan's follow Lonergan talks about data, understanding, insight, and judgment. A lot of people have insights, some of them are wrong. So we have to realize we are interpreting our religious experience. And in conversation, maybe we'll keep refining that interpretation. But if we take it as classical, it's easier that way. It's easier to run an organization that way. If everybody starts thinking, that gets really tough. You want to take a break? Let's take a short break, 5 minutes, and then come back. And then I'd like to talk about my third theme, story, evolution as a story, with many levels. Oh. I'm sorry, some of you, I know I dropped my voice, and every word is important, I'm sorry. Would you stand up and wave if you're not hearing me? Jim Oberman, can you hear me? It's better. I'm glad to see the social sciences are also present against the back wall. Lots of science here tonight, that's wonderful. Okay, now we get into the theological part, which is particular to me. But my thought is, if I go through my process, you go through your process. And that's all. I'm just offering you my process. I'm assuming this is a fairly diverse group spiritually. And that's what makes it rich. So, putting it this way, I owe a lot to John Hott, but John Hott owes a lot to Ralston, and Ralston owes a lot to everybody. So it's, as I say, this is really an intertextual conversation. But I think of evolution as a story, and even that for some people, they wouldn't even call it a story. I think I'd like to talk about evolution as a story. I'm talking about the evolution of the world, of the cosmos. We only know it from the Big Bang. That's pretty far back. Big Bang all the way up through human consciousness and civilizations. That's what I'm talking about. That's a big story. And that story can be read on different levels. One could see evolution as a purely physical, chemical process. That already has a fair amount of meaning, I think. Or you can see that story as just a jumble. And there are people writing books defending that. It's just a jumble without direction or meaning. Or one could see evolution as a story with some intelligence to it. I'm thinking of Teilhard de Chardin. I'm thinking especially of Thomas Berry, who got me into this. Well, Thomas Chardin also in the 60s. And Thomas Berry and Brian Swim, who's a physicist turned writer, or Ken Wilber, who wrote A Theory of Everything. Elizabeth Johnson, John Hott. I'm also thinking of the Hebrew Bible, which is sort of a story about creation. And as John Hott says, and it's the title of his book that hasn't been printed yet, but it's coming out this month or so, it's an unfinished story. And that's what makes it hard to interpret. But even though the story is not finished and we have entered the story late, not so late that we can't ask, where is the story going? And the problem of evil and the suffering and the fact that everything seems to perish, it makes a drama out of the story. It's a pretty exciting story. It's like you're halfway through a novel and you're wondering, where is this going? Is he ever going to finish? Is it, that's sort of where we're at. And I guess the point I'd like to make tonight, because is that unless you have been really exposed to that story by a master storyteller, you aren't going to be engaged by the conversation about evolution as having meaning or not. You have to know the story. In every book on science and religion, they have one marvelous paragraph telling the story from the Big Bang to human consciousness. In one paragraph they do it. I don't think that's going to change your life. So I'm thinking of, did you ever read Theologian de Chardin? Some of us did, who are that old. Yes. In the 60s. Thomas Berry, The Dream of the Earth. Thomas Berry and Brian Swim wrote a book called The Universe Story. And there's a chapter on the Big Bang. There's a chapter on what happened in the milliseconds after the Big Bang. There's a chapter on planets. There's a chapter on Earth. There's a chapter on the role of the sun. Whole chapter. It's a whole chapter on photosynthesis. And he goes on. A whole chapter on human consciousness. I mean, we talked the last couple years ago, we talked about Robert Bell, who wrote a book, Religion in Human History, from the Paleolithic to the Axial Age. I mean, it's a big story. So in this book by Brian Swim, he talks about the development of cultures and civilizations, and wherever you get it, if you can really get that whole thing, then you know what the question is about. Is that story without meaning? Is it without direction? Is it worth thinking about? Or is it nothing? Is it just chemicals? What is it? So it seems to me that's a point I'd like to make, that find it somewhere. If you're going to get into this conversation, you need to be exposed to that story. And I think Brian Swim, for me, was a big help. Roger Haidt, and Ralston too in all of his books on science and religion, talk about levels of interpretation. Ralston goes through all the disciplines and shows how, maybe you'll object to this later and you can, but how physics can't answer the questions of psychology, and psychology can't answer the questions of sociology, etc. They're not designed to do that. There are different levels. And when we go deeper or higher or wider in our reading of a story, we tend to leave literal language behind, and we reach for symbol and metaphor, analogy, poetry, narrative, and drama. And that's what I'm saying about religion. Not only religion, I think quantum physics can't do any better. They have to reach for metaphor and symbol. And scientists love metaphors. And everything you read about, the entire computer language is metaphor. If you think about it, wastebaskets and all that stuff, they're all metaphors. Hot is an example which I'll just develop a little bit. It's almost a trite example, but say the water's boiling. Why is the water boiling? Well, because the molecules are jumping around and creates heat. We call that boiling. Well, why is the water boiling? Well, somebody turned the stove on. That's a kind of a different question. Why did she turn the stove on? Well, she took Jim Boyd's classes and she thinks the tea ceremony is really important. So now her worldview's involved in why the water is boiling. So there are levels of reading a story. It's important for a man to be married to a woman because men don't always get this. Women read the symbolic language in movies and novels. They're more skilled sometimes. The history of Robert Bellah talks about original language is mimetic, the sort of gestures and motions, and he talks about dogs who they have such a language with. So it's mimetic, it's metaphorical, it's symbolic, it's metaphorical, and eventually it becomes abstract. And the people who study hermeneutics and the history of religions, they think that primary religious language is metaphorical and symbolic and narrative and drama. And later on, when you have to set boundaries and really understand it rationally, then you have doctrines and abstract language. But primary religious language is symbolic. And so if one is to, so religions use multiple literary genres. They use narrative, they use drama, they use epic poetry, they use symbols. And if one doesn't understand the literary genre, one doesn't understand what's being said. There's a moving moment in the autobiography of Jung, who was in what was then called an insane asylum or a mental hospital, and he was a neurologist. And he had this insight, these people aren't crazy. They're really trying to say something, but we don't understand their language. We got to try and find out what are they saying. They're speaking symbolically, but they're not talking. They're saying something, and that's what I'd like to say to some people about religion. They're not crazy, but if you say you approach a virgin birth, let's say, and you're from a purely empirical point of view, you can't measure it, or if you can, it can't happen. It just can't happen. But what if you say, well, maybe it's a metaphor, maybe it's a symbol. Why would they have said it? Well, maybe if you think that Jesus is a story of God, then you simplify that and say Jesus is God. Well, it's much easier if Jesus is God if he doesn't have a human father. So that's what was going on there. You just had kind of a break. That's one way of looking at it. So they're not crazy. They have this sense that they encountered God in the life of Jesus. That gets oversimplified in the language. And virgin birth is one way to sort of deal with that. I'm not saying everything is that kind of a myth, but I have changed enormously in the past 20 years with my conversations, partly because one of my reading groups includes a mythologist, Carol Mitchell and Jim Boyd and things like that. So myth, I don't like the word demythologizing anymore, because it sort of assumes that myth is bad, that myth isn't true, the symbol isn't true. My whole presupposition in this talk is that metaphor is profoundly true. But you have to understand that it's a metaphor. I gave you a handout because it's amazing to me that Pope Francis seems to be taking that into account very explicitly in his encyclical on climate change. I think you have it. See if I have it. Linda, do you have it? I could read it from the stream, from the Okay, here's what he's saying, and you have it. Just notice how he's using religious language. The creation accounts in the book of Genesis contain in their own symbolic and narrative language profound teachings about human existence and human reality. So he's not taking it literally, but he says there's profound teaching involved there, even though it's symbolic language. That's quite a distinction. These ancient stories, full of symbolism, bear witness to a conviction which we today share that everything is interconnected, that genuine care for our own lives and our own relationships with nature is inseparable from fraternity, justice, and fruitfulness to others. Is that what creationists mean? Creation science? Is that what they mean, that the Bible is teaching justice? The Pope is saying this symbolism is saying something, but it's not telling you how the earth was scientifically made. It's talking about justice and interconnection and human relationships. The universe unfolds in God who fills it completely. Hence there is a mystical meaning to be found in a leaf, in a mountain trail, in a dewdrop, in a poor person's face. And that's where he has the footnote to the Sufi mystic. And then finally down below, this is not because the finite things of this world are really divine, but because the mystic experiences the intimate connection between God and all things, and thus feels that all things are God. That's what they feel. And I just like to say, a metaphor always is and is not at the same time. And unless you hold both of those, and it's not true literally, but it's true. It is and it is not. And it seems to me when we argue, one person is defending the is not of it, and the other person is defending the is of it. And the only way out is to see it as a dialectical tension, a symbolic statement. I think that's what is going on there. The mystic, for all intents and purposes, this is God. I like the word symbol. That's part of my understanding of this. Roger Haight, Paul Tillich, Karl Rahner, Roger Haight. A symbol is the manifestation of something. It's a real manifestation, like a dream. But the literal meaning of the dream isn't a dream is a symbol, but the real point of the dream is that it reveals to me this subterranean world that I don't know much about. That's the bigger meaning of the dream than just... So a symbol is evoking a sense of something bigger. So if you see the whole world as a story of God, I'd like to give you some examples. And I'm not saying you should believe this. I'm not assuming you should believe this. And I'm in process. But I just want you to understand how religious language works. And I'm saying if you have an exclusively empirical language, nothing exists that can't be measured. You can't understand religious language, let alone disagree with it. You can't even disagree with it because you don't get it yet. You have to understand it to disagree with it. Unless you think the whole thing is crazy because there's so many crazy people doing it. But I decided to read the Gospel of John a few years ago because it was the hardest gospel to read because fundamentalists love it. And I advertised it by saying, I think I'm a postmodern person, and I'd like to find out what a postmodern person can do with the Gospel of John. Would you like to join me? And I had a wonderful group come. It took 2 semesters to get through the Gospel of John. And the first thing I found out about the Gospel of John is it's a sectarian community. They weren't in with pluralism. They were just an isolated community among Christians and Jews, sectarian. And they had this experience of Jesus. And so we look at the literary genre and the language, and the commentators say, the 4th Gospel is a poetic narrative dramatization of what a sectarian community made of Jesus. Now I know that's a mouthful. That's why I didn't want to stand up straight, I'd fall off. It's a poetic narrative dramatization of what that community made of. That's what I mean by knowledge, what you make of it. It's not pure photocopies. You're sort of making something out of it. So the Gospel of John makes a lot of sense if you realize this is the way we experience Him as God. So when He says, I'm God, you better believe it. If you take that as a narrative dramatization, they experience this as a story of God. I'm not saying you should, but at least you can understand the Gospel of John a lot better if you realize that's what's going on. And the Gospel of John is really exciting if you can understand it that way. Another example, Nicholas Lash, who's a British theologian, tells the story of Tobias and the angel. I don't know if you remember Tobias and the angel, but Tobias says to the angel, you took me on this journey and you said we were going to see God. But all you have shown me are people, nice people, good people. And the angel says, well, what do you think God would look like if He walked this earth? That's interesting. What do you think God would look like if He walked this earth? So the earth, where are you getting your knowledge of God? I think if you could take, for some people at least, if you could take religious language in a more poetic way and not get hung up on the rationalization of it. I might have time sometimes in the early morning trying to say the Lord's Prayer, and I say, God, heaven, a few other words in there, kingdom. But if I go with the poetry, it makes enormous sense. I spend enough time in the New Testament. I can still really enjoy the New Testament. I do the readings every morning. First I do my mindfulness, then I read the scripture readings. And I see the poetry, I see the mythology, and like Jim Boyd on his encounter of these other cultures, I see the archetypal in the particular. And that is very liberating. So it's not just good news for me, it's what's going on in the world that they are seeing and manifesting. Are you getting what I'm saying? That's a huge challenge in the conversation between science and religion. If all you have is empirical language and an empirical worldview, empirical meaning you can measure it, wouldn't include religious experience, it's going to be hard to understand the poetic nature of religious language. I guess I've said it, so maybe you would like to comment. I'm sure my friend here will have a comment. All of my friends. There's one in the back.
But doesn't science as science?
What's that?
Doesn't
Wait, get the microphone.
Where are we? Here?
Doesn't science as science reject teleology altogether? I'm thinking the Quran has that verse that Allah created the clouds to give shade to man. That's a purposeful kind of explanation of clouds, but it doesn't help us understand the material and efficient and formal causes of clouds. And I think you've hit upon a major distinction here between science and religion. Religion embraces teleology. I don't think science does.
Maybe evolution would change the religious person's understanding of teleology.
If Darwin...
I think teleology, I don't think that's of the essence of religion. That's a philosophical approach to
I mean by
reality.
teleology.
Pardon? Teleology means that it's done for a purpose.
Yeah.
Now,
That things do what they...
would natural selection, survival of the fittest qualify?
No. Darwin believed in chance. Pure
Yeah,
chance.
but is there no progress? Has nothing happened since the Big Bang?
Progress is a human construction.
Pardon?
progress is a kind of human.
Well, everything, including your understanding of teleology, is a human construction.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying I don't think science embraces teleology.
Science may not, but
yeah.
Science...
And I think that's a major distinction. I think you beautifully pointed that out.
I guess I would think my understanding of teleology has changed because of evolution. It makes progress by chance.
Yeah, Tay Hardy.
But chance isn't the whole story. There's also, I mean, Hobbes says, if you look at too big, is there any progress? Well, it keeps producing more, it seems like, that story. That's something interesting. It keeps producing beauty.
Didn't Teilhard have to reject the second law of thermodynamics?
I don't know. I don't know about that. Tell me.
I think he did.
Entropy, I don't know if he did. As I recall, you're living in this tension between entropy and evolution is a 1 in a million breakthrough, the entropy. And somehow or other, you want to save that breakthrough, and that's the genetic code or education.
I bring this up because this is a big issue in my field, psychology. A lot of psychologists, as you know, wanted to create a discipline free of the idea of purpose.
Yeah, I think that's a philosophical position, not a scientific position.
Why is Johnny not performing in school? He's lazy. Well, that doesn't explain anything about Johnny. Laziness is a purposeful kind of, you're attributing something to Johnny that you've created. But when you really get to looking at Johnny, better to look at antecedents.
Yeah. Well, I understand.
Material causes and efficient causes.
It seems to me, you can argue that, and I'm not saying it's not a good argument. We've been talking a long time, but I think that's a philosophical statement, not a scientific statement. So it's not a conflict between science and religion, it's a conflict of philosophies. I don't see how you can say, just because science can't see it, is there nothing, if science can't see it, does it not exist?
I think Darwin really
That's a question.
Yeah, Darwinian evolution is based on chance.
And natural selection and survival of the fittest. So not just chance. Okay, but that's an argument. That's the difference. So is there a story? And is there a story of God? That's the question. And not everybody is going to believe in God. I mean, there again, what do you mean by God? I always say, well, I don't believe in the God you don't believe in either. And I'm serious on that, because I never think people know what I mean by God. It's hard for me to understand. But that's an odd thing for saying it, because that is the issue. Are you going to see in this story, are there trends? Is there anything accomplished through that's what I meant, unless you're exposed to this story. And it seems to me like I read, again, that story, the universe story, in 1 week, just so I get the whole thing in one sitting. It's pretty overwhelming when you get that story. And is there any meaning in there? Is there any sense of spirit? Is there any irrepressible sense of life that just keeps coming and producing more? We don't all answer that the same way. A very rich man told me once that's why people raise horses. They don't interpret reality the same way. But I think those are the choices. And that's what John Hott calls, I think, scientific naturalism. And I think Don Crosby would like to be called a naturalist. I think that's a friend of ours, and to whom I owe unbelievable enlightenment. So, any other comments on that? That's a good one. Teleology, in case you're not a philosopher, teleology is, I think, that everything is created for a purpose, and God created the purpose. In a simple view, God created that purpose ahead of time. So it's kind of confining notion. And but I don't think, to be a religious person, I have to accept that notion of teleology. I don't. I think God created creative people because that was a creative thing to do. Who knows where it's going to end.
Taking your thoughts to a different level, maybe more related to literature and poetry. It seems to me that we have numerous examples of great literature on the subject of war. And each of us could probably mention something we have read recently. And some of it quite profound, some of it drags you into the reality of evil in a way that you don't want particularly, but also the reality of goodness and kindness of one to another. But war still exists, and in some cases, our knowledge and love of God, or whatever being we call God, if we do believe. And I think you could say the same thing of poetry. Think of all the rich, beautiful, profound poets who deal with spiritual life in one form or another. And I think we don't only learn of God or experience God in a theology class or a scripture class. I think that our experience of the holy comes in many forms. And so people may have a rich and different experiences of God based on things such as literature, poetry, and certainly the group you belong to are examples of people. Two of the women are in that group are in the English department at CSU, so I'm sure they can speak to that.
Well, Fisher, that's a nice comment on, I think, a quote from the Sufi mystic. Those are rather poetry, literature mediates those kinds of experiences very well, better than abstract thought does. I don't know if that's what you're saying, but
But I'm also saying we write of war, we deal with great novels that relate to war, and yet we have not solved the problem of war and hate and injustice, just as theology has not.
Right. That's what makes the story a drama. We don't know how it's going to end. It's unfinished. We're in the middle of it. It's exciting and scary. But
So Joachim, a long time ago, you gave the example of story in the context of personal story. In the context of personal story. So you talked about how, as a human, we're born into the story that's always already ongoing. And we have to learn what the past story was to understand ourselves, as well as to create the story in the future.
yes.
That's a very process way of looking at it as well. And it's interesting that even though that is the way we are, we tend to make the world concrete and not process.
Stop it. Yeah. That's really Thomas Berry, who was reacting against this dominating the earth, that man was created to dominate the earth, or even being a steward of the earth, that we know better. His sense was go back over the story of the earth and get a sense of its dynamic and get a sense of its dream. And humans' job would be to facilitate the unfolding of that dream as a less dominating way of relating to nature. But it fits with what I'm saying now. Is there a meaning to the story? Is there a direction to the story? And I think that's what, for me, that's what religious people mean by experiences of spirit. That there's this sense of life going through, which transcends the everyday and can only be spoken of. So here's where I am. Here's where this has left me. And I realize not all of you, but you can figure out where this leaves you. And if you want to say that, You're welcome, but I mean, more than welcome, I would like to hear it. But let me just conclude with where I am as someone who still identifies as a religious person, a Christian religious person. First of all, as a Unitarian minister said to me a while ago, pardon me, I use the word God for want of a better word. It's the best I have to say what I want to say. I can't find an alternative. With all its bad baggage, it's still saying something I need to say. And Paul Tillich said, the word God is really a code for God. So, what I mean by God is the holy mystery within which we live. Karl Rahner suggested this is a wintry time for faith. And maybe the word God has too much baggage. And maybe for starters, we shouldn't use the word God, but for starters, maybe we should talk about the mystery within which we live. So, what I mean by God is the holy mystery within which we live. More unknown than known. And at the same time, I experience all of creation as God's unfolding, as God's body. It's a metaphor. It both is and is not. Thomas Aquinas said you make progress in your understanding of God in proportion as you recognize the inadequacy of all of your images. So, I mean, that's dialectical language. And the problem with preaching and arguing is we don't use language dialectical. Our language should show that we know it's symbolic language, that the metaphor always both is and is not. And I can understand why some people are overtaken by the is not part of it, and other people are in ecstasy because of the is part of it. And it would be nice if you could hold them both in tension, which is what a metaphor is, I think. So what I mean by God is the holy mystery within which we live, more unknown than known. And at the same time, I experience all of creation as God's body. I start with experiences of spirit. You can read Elizabeth Johnson for great discussions of that, and Ken Wilber. What is it that urges us forward and outward? So, for the New Testament, the love of God is poured out into our hearts by the Spirit which has been given to us. So I start out with experiences of spirit. I move on to what would God look like if God walked this earth? I find that Jesus, the life of Jesus, the Jesus event, revelatory in this sense. Jesus is, I always said, the human face of God. Maybe now I'd say a human face of God. For you, maybe a classic. For me, maybe the classic. See the difference? And finally, I acknowledge God as the ultimate mystery. Rahner suggests we think of God as the wither of our unrestricted desire to know and love. The wither. That leaves a lot of room for progress and process and not knowing, seems to me. So I experience the holy mystery, sounds very Catholic, as immanent, incarnate, and transcendent. Immanent in the Spirit, incarnate in Christ, and also in the Dalai Lama, and transcendent, unknown, unknowable, inexpressible. And yet, I experience the universe story as the body of God, and the universe story as a story of God. At least you know what I think. You may or may not be able to buy that. That's where I end up with this conversation as a Christian theologian, in case you're wondering.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wait,
Yeah, you should have written that up, so we could.
I could put it on the website, that page.
Okay, that would be good.
Are we taking questions?
Yes,
Okay.
but
Yeah,
only with the microphone.
Yeah, we would love to put that on the webpage. if you-
Okay.
Mary Jane Ward? Put it close to your mouth.
Mary Jane and Bob Geller have something in common. I won't say what it is. They're even older than I am.
Well, Joachim,
Closer, closer.
as you presented your thinking, your persuasions through your many experiences, I was reminded of the fact that we are living now both in time and space when there is such a manifestation of the speed with which events take place. But the story has so many chapters spread out across the universe that the time-honored method by which to kind of lodge your thinking about here and hereafter that always came, I mean not always, but usually came through the instrumentality of the church, whatever church it was. These times have made it difficult, it seems to me, to see the place of the church as a ratification of justice, which, to my way of thinking, and speaking of processing, I have always felt that religion really is a point of justice.
Religious,
Is a point of
religious
justice.
freedom, did you
It is
say?
the location of justice.
Yes.
That when I pursue religious thought, I am thinking in terms of justice. Because I am indebted for my life to a power which overwhelmed me in birth and overwhelmed me all the way through my life and still overwhelms me. And when the instrumentality of organized religion comes into your view at a very early age, before you're able, even as far as our tradition is concerned, to know what's going on, and you live your life through the processing of formal religion, it seems to me that the breath of freshness, which is the message of the Creator, as seen in all of manifest nature, and all of human behavior which in any way resembles the goodness of that Creator. It seems to me that these are times that are just absolutely very wearing upon all of us souls. And when the headlines bring you the profound suffering that is being experienced in Central Europe right now, not alone there. And we ask ourselves, what religious thought supports me? Or what spiritual flight can I take that will in any way address the disturbance that I feel? And it seems to me that it's at that particular point that we are dreadfully in need of enough peace in the order of time and space to reflect upon the things that you've told us today. So the missing element, whether in science or religion, is the use of both time and space in reflecting upon the things which have been given to us and which we can multiply so many times for each other. So I think we are at a point of the human dilemma when it only can turn to spiritual reflection, which always is just a grace because we don't earn it and we can't buy it, and we can't bargain for it. So these are the days, I think, for just praying for the grace to not endure the times, but to in some way try to find a place for ourselves in them. And that usually is prayer, I think.
Thank you, Mary Jane. My purpose tonight was to see how a conversation between science and religion is possible. But both you and Ellen are saying, where does that leave us spiritually? That's what we're concerned about.
Yeah.
And you're reminding me, I wanted to say, I think Pope Francis gets what you're saying, personally, and I've not been a fan of popes. Those of you who know me, I know that. But this guy gets a lot of it, and he uses the word integral ecology. Teilhard de Chardin had a view of the whole universe, including human consciousness and human civilizations, as a single living organism. And the Pope keeps using a word which reminds me of Ken Wilber, because he keeps using the word integral. The Pope takes ecosystem, a physical ecosystem, and he uses that as a metaphor for the whole ball of wax, including human life and civilizations. And he's saying we are an interrelated living organism with consciousness and moral questions and moral responsibilities. And we are interrelated. And that's why we love the earth. And there's a final thing, and where that's his thing about ecology. That's why, as a theologian, the Pope, as a person of faith, why is he writing about climate change? Because he sees us as all of a piece, all one family, and we have a moral obligation to hold it together. And he says, we have, and this picture from NASA is so moving to me. It gets some distance from your life. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air, and we receive life and refreshment from her waters. And as I reviewed my shelf full of books, I have 3 pages of bibliography here on science and religion. If I'm looking for a spiritual book on science and religion, I mean, the best one I've seen for a long time is that encyclical on climate change. I would just beg you to read it. It's 77 pages. I printed it out. It's pretty long, but I think it's worth reading. There was a guy, you know those funny guys, sometimes for entertainment we see funny things, McLaughlin guys. There's one there, they were all just saying, what's the Pope talking about science? He's crazy. And the Jewish guy, McLaughlin just fawns over him. He's the publisher of the New U.S. News and World Report. He said, climate change is a serious thing. And this man is a serious man with a serious position. And he has written something really thoughtful. And I admire him for that. I thought that's the beginning of conversation. The others were just saying, don't read this stuff. What could he possibly have to say? And he said, he's in quite a position. This is really a serious issue. I respect him for writing it. So that might, I don't want to end it necessarily, but it's almost it. Anybody else?
Any questions?
Thank you so much. You've been just